Good afternoon, this is the Genealogy radio show, and this is Shannon O'Grady speaking. And today I am joined with Cian Rowan. Cian, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks very much.
He's going to be talking about the Fitzgerald family.
Right, so last time I spoke about the Fitzgerald family on the Genealogy radio show, I covered the life of Garret Fitzgerald, an 8th Earl of Kildare, and the head of the Fitzgerald family until 1513, when he was killed by soldiers of the O'Carroll family. Those of you who listened to that show will be familiar with Garret, but just in case you missed it, I'll give you a quick refresher on him. Garret Fitzgerald was offered the position of Lord Deputy by Henry VII in 1496. The office of Lord Deputy was a position that effectively ruled Ireland in the name of the English throne. This was a necessary move on King Henry's part, as England was almost bankrupt following the War of the Roses, which ended in 1485. By ruling Ireland indirectly, Henry could keep hold of the hard-won English territories on the island and minimise the cost of doing so. So it was that Garret Fitzgerald ascended to the deputyship in 1496, having won King Henry's confidence through his battles against Gaelic Irish lords. Garret would serve as Lord Deputy for 17 long years, and spent much of his time campaigning up and down Ireland against various disgruntled Irish lords. When he wasn't fighting, Garret secured alliances with those lords who lay outside English influence by offering them protection from their rivals in exchange for taxation. All in all, he was a very effective Lord Deputy, and Henry VII must have felt that he'd made the right choice by picking him. However, Garret did very well out of the arrangement as well. 17 years is a long time to spend as the so-called uncrowned King of Ireland. Many of the Irish lords Garret subdued through war or diplomacy began to identify more with him than with Henry VII as their feudal overlord. As I've said, Garret was ultimately killed in 1513 by the O'Carrolls, so any speculation on what might have been is not of much use. However, even though Garret Fitzgerald was dead, his family had been thrust firmly into the ascendancy by the years spent in the corridors of power. Garret Og, literally meaning young or little Garret, was the son of the recently deceased Garret Fitzgerald. Garret Og often chose to go by Gerald rather than his father's namesake, and for convenience that's how I will refer to him from this point onwards. With the death of his father, Gerald was the new head of the Fitzgerald family and the 9th Earl of Kildare. By this point, Henry VII was dead, and Henry VIII, a character who most of us will already be familiar with, had taken the throne in 1509. Following Garret Fitzgerald's death, Henry needed to pick a new Lord Deputy to look after Ireland as the English economic recovery continued. The position was not hereditary by any means, so Henry could have picked anyone in theory. However, Gerald ended up in the post just as his father had, and largely for the same reasons. Henry VIII knew that the Lord Deputy needed to be a man who understood the culture in Ireland and had the connections necessary to keep the peace on the island with minimal effort. Due to Garret Fitzgerald's astute marriage arrangement skills, the Fitzgeralds had connections and allies in abundance across Ireland. Though Gerald was technically a good pick for Lord Deputy, it is easy to imagine that Henry felt uneasy about offering him the post. Gerald was a very different sort of man to his father. While Garret had been soldier first and diplomat second, with Gerald it was very much the other way around. A canny man, and known to be inclined to factionalism and feuding, Gerald proved to be much more difficult to manage than his father had been. Indeed, Gerald's fondness for feuding caused the revival of the hostilities between the Butlers of Ormond and the Fitzgerald family, which had been put to rest during Garret's lifetime. The last thing the Lord Deputy was supposed to do was start unnecessary wars in Ireland. Such things did more to destabilise the island than anything else. Gerald was a clever man, though, and he knew that he needed to make himself appear indispensable in the eyes of Henry and his administrators. By doing so, he could ensure that the English crown would overlook his feuding with the Butlers and allow him a free hand against them. In order to paint himself as essential staff in the governance of Ireland, Gerald used his connections outside the Pale to tacitly contact his cousins in Western Ireland. He let them know that if they were to start raiding the Pale for plunder, he would make only token efforts to stop them. Sure enough, when the Pale began to come under attack from multiple Gaelic Irish chiefs and earls, after a while, Garret decided that he'd allowed the raids to take place for long enough, and marched out of the Pale to beat the Gaelic lords back into line. In this way, Gerald made himself appear the saviour of the Pale, even though it had been him that orchestrated the raids to begin with. Ironically, it was these very connections and allies that had made him a good pick for Lord Deputy that allowed him to pursue this course. Gerald repeated this ruse several times during his career, and it seems to have been effective. Whether or not Henry VIII had his suspicions about Gerald is unknown, but in the end, it would not be Gerald's false flag raids that led to his downfall. While the Fitzgerald family had become wealthy and powerful through 2 generations of Lord Deputies, the English treasury had been recovering too. The Civil War of 1485 was becoming a distant memory, and without the drain of administrating Ireland, England was getting back on its feet. With England recovering, Henry VIII and his administrators began to pay more attention to what was going on across the Channel. Unfortunately for Gerald, this new scrutiny corresponded with a number of complaints from prominent nobles in the Pale about the Fitzgerald family. The main theme of these complaints concerned the unfair political hegemony that the Fitzgeralds sat at the head of in Ireland. Some lords also expressed worries at the disproportionate amount of power Gerald was able to bring to bear on his rivals, even given his position as deputy. It was these worrying complaints that first drew suspicion on the Fitzgerald family from King Henry. Up until this point, King Henry VIII and his father before him had been willing to overlook the growing power of the Fitzgerald family in exchange for a quiet and, most importantly, inexpensive Ireland. However, now Henry began to worry that he had allowed a potential rival to accrue power to himself. It is important to remember that at this time, the English grip on Ireland was still quite tenuous. The famous Tudor reconquest had not yet taken place, and would not for some time yet. An overly powerful vassal was a real worry to Henry VIII, and a danger to his control of Ireland. Given the information that had just come to light and the accusations levelled against him, Gerald decided upon a course of action that, with hindsight, was probably the worst thing he could have done. He began to embark on a number of rather suspicious activities that did not help his standing with Henry VIII. Chief among these actions was that he began to move artillery out of Dublin Castle and into his own castles in Kildare. This in itself was not unusual. As deputy, Gerald had the right to reposition state assets in order to defend the island. However, the timing for this could not have been worse, given the suspicion that he was under. Gerald claimed that the trouble on the borders of the Pale had compelled him to move the artillery, but this excuse did not convince Henry. Soon after Gerald had finished moving the artillery from Dublin to his own forts, he received a summons from the court of the king, demanding that he come to England at once. Quite understandably, Gerald was of the opinion that a trip to England at this particularly delicate time could prove hazardous to his health. He decided to put off going for as long as he could, claiming that he needed to recover from a wound he had recently received. A follow-up letter soon arrived from Henry, demanding that Gerald travel anyway, but with the concession that he could appoint a Lord Deputy in his absence. Gerald found these terms acceptable, and designated his son, Thomas Fitzgerald, the Lord of Offaly, as Lord Deputy in his stead. Thomas Fitzgerald is the last person I'll be talking about in this story. His actions would ultimately lead to the destruction of the Fitzgerald family, and pave the way for the Tudor reconquest of Ireland. Several of Thomas's actions following his father's summons to England could be called foolish with hindsight. However, it is important to remember that Thomas was only 21 years old when he was given the deputyship. It is hard to imagine giving so much responsibility to a person so young in modern times. In the 16th century, such things were commonplace. Those of you who are already familiar with the Fitzgerald family may have heard Thomas being referred to as Silken Thomas. He acquired the nickname from the way he made his soldiers wear expensive silken headscarves around their helmets, so that they would be instantly recognisable as his men. It was also a way for Thomas to flaunt his wealth, further demonstrating his youthful mental state. Before I get into the story of Thomas properly, I need to return briefly to his father Gerald and the outcome of his trip to England. Gerald must have known that he had fallen under suspicion from King Henry, but he also knew that he was a good diplomat and felt that he could argue his own case well enough to be pardoned. After all, this was not in fact the first time he'd been summoned to England. On several occasions in the past, the king had called upon Gerald to answer less serious charges, and each time, Gerald had walked away unpunished. It was a reasonable argument to make that this is why Gerald felt it was safe to travel to England, leaving Thomas in control. Unfortunately for Gerald, Henry was in no mood to play games. As soon as Gerald arrived in England, he was brought before the king to be questioned. Whatever it was that Gerald said to defend himself, it did not satisfy Henry, and he ordered that Gerald be imprisoned pending further questioning. This was not the end of the world for the Fitzgerald family. The situation could yet be salvaged if the execution of Gerald could be avoided. Unfortunately for them, their enemies were hard at work ensuring that this hiccup in relations became something far more serious. Somebody, it is not known exactly who, forged a letter and had it sent to Thomas Fitzgerald back in Kildare. The letter claimed that Henry VIII had not just imprisoned Gerald pending further questioning, he had executed him for treason. Whoever sent that letter clearly wanted to capitalise on Thomas's youthful belligerence, and hoped that Thomas would act without checking to verify that the letter was real. Whoever this anonymous enemy of the Fitzgerald family was, they got exactly what they wanted. In 1534, Thomas raised his banner in rebellion against Henry VIII. Distraught at the news of his father's death, Thomas gathered his troops to him and marched to Mary's Abbey, where the Privy Council was conducting a meeting. In a move that likely appealed to Thomas for its sheer drama, he burst into the abbey and threw down the sword of state on the table before the councillors. He then loudly declared, "I am no longer Henry Tudor's deputy. I am his foe." Casting your sword at the feet of your king is traditionally a declaration of intent, the intent, of course, being to rebel. Given that Henry VIII was across the sea, his administrators were the next best thing. The ceremonial way that Thomas chose to declare his rebellion says something about his mindset, as well as the mindset of many other Anglo-Norman lords who were his contemporaries. This casting down of the sword was a hangover from the Middle Ages, and had become less relevant as the early modern period rolled onwards. The way that Thomas chose to rebel speaks to how he and his fellows were still hanging on to the traditions of the medieval era, while England and continental Europe had begun to move on. The old ways of feudalism were rapidly becoming irrelevant, and modern state building, where powerful vassals had no place, was taking over. Returning to Thomas before we get too sidetracked, no sooner had Thomas cut his ties with Henry VIII, news reached him that his father was alive and likely aghast at his son's course of action. Unfortunately for Thomas, there was no turning back now, and he had to go through with his rebellion for better or for worse. Wasting no time, he led his men to Dublin and laid siege to the castle. In an attempt to gather support from other Irish lords, and perhaps even from abroad, Thomas branded his rebellion as a Catholic crusade against Henry VIII, who had famously snubbed the Catholic Church. However, this did not work out for Thomas the way he wanted it to. The first problem was with that, in the 16th century, Ireland did not have the tradition of dedicated Catholicism that it would come to be known for in later centuries. Most Irish lords felt that religion was largely irrelevant when the question of what constitutes a valid cause for war was concerned. Furthermore, any hopes of garnering support from Catholic kings abroad were dashed after the murder of Archbishop Allen. The Archbishop was a known opponent of the Geraldine dynasty, who the Fitzgeralds were a major branch of. Knowing how much danger he was in from Thomas's approaching troops, the Archbishop decided to flee the city by boat, but was driven ashore and executed by Thomas's men. Sources differ on whether or not Thomas ordered the murder of the Archbishop, but either way, the act earned Thomas and his supporters an excommunication from Pope Clement VII. This was a serious blow to Thomas, but he pressed on and attempted to summon help from the Lords of the Pale and beyond. Some did choose to join him. Those that didn't were imprisoned by Thomas at his castle in Maynooth. Following this, Thomas doubled down on his stance and announced that anyone found to be born in England would be exiled or executed. By July of 1534, Thomas had decided that waiting any longer would be to invite retribution from across the Channel. He ordered an assault on the walls of Dublin Castle. An outright assault is always a dangerous gamble in any siege, and Thomas was once again unlucky. His army was routed under the walls of Dublin Castle, and Thomas elected to retreat to his stronghold in Maynooth to await the army from England that must surely come. He clearly felt that he could hold out against the English there, just as the English themselves had done in Dublin. The army that Thomas feared would come arrived in Dublin in 1535, led by Sir William Skeffington. His force was small, but very well equipped and experienced. Thomas waited in Maynooth, confident in the strength of his castle walls. However, in yet another instance of tragically poor timing, the castle was betrayed to Skeffington by a bribed guard in March of 1535, while Thomas was away gathering troops to reinforce it. The entire garrison of Maynooth Castle was executed in what was later dubbed the Maynooth Pardon. The capture of his biggest and best manned castle proved to be too great a blow for Thomas, and he petitioned Lord Leonard Grey, who by this point had been named Lord Deputy, for peace and pardon for his transgressions. Henry was still desperate to avoid spending money, and knew that Thomas had the potential to cause serious difficulties for England, even following his two serious defeats. Keeping this in mind, he ordered Lord Grey to offer Thomas a guarantee of protection if he would come to England and throw himself upon Henry's mercy. Given what we know about Henry VIII now, asking him for mercy was probably a poor move, but Thomas was clearly desperate. He was thrown into the Tower of London as a prisoner. His father Gerald was at this point truly dead, having died of an illness in prison in late 1534. Thomas lived on in prison until February 1537, when he and his 5 uncles were taken to Tyburn and unceremoniously executed. Thomas's uncles were hung, drawn, and quartered, but Thomas himself was at least granted the dignity of being beheaded. He was little more than a boy when he died, but his rebellion had far-reaching implications, despite being a complete failure. In many ways, it sounded the death knell of Gaelic Ireland, as it was followed by the 60-year Tudor conquest of Ireland, where Henry and his descendants attempted to disempower the Gaelic Irish lords and solidify English control on the island. Henry VIII was assured by his advisors that the death of Thomas and his uncles would mean the end of the troublesome Geraldine dynasty. However, this was not entirely true. The dynasty was indeed laid low by the rebellion of Silken Thomas, but there were survivors, and the seeds were sown for the Geraldines to rise to prominence again, both on the continent and in Ireland. The Fitzgerald branch of the Geraldines, however, was practically annihilated.
Thank you, Cian. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. This show is aired every Thursday and it is repeated again on Sunday. Goodbye for now. Thank you.